HOA Karen calls 911 because she can't use my land as a public road anymore. So I recently found myself in the middle of a situation involving my property, an HOA, and a few entitled neighbors who believed my land was their personal shortcut. Let me take you back to the beginning. About a year ago, I moved into my dream home. It's a peaceful, secluded property with a beautiful stretch of land that borders a neighborhood managed by an HOA. When I bought it, I never imagined there'd be any issues until I came face to face with just how entitled some HOA members can be. Here's the thing. My property includes a narrow strip of land that connects to one of the HOA streets. It's not an actual road, but it looks clear enough that someone might mistake it for one. And that's exactly what started happening. Cars began using it as a shortcut. At first, I thought maybe it was something the previous owners allowed or an old path they used. But then, it got strange. I noticed fresh tire tracks almost every day, and soon enough I woke up on a Saturday morning to see a parade of cars cutting across my property as if it was their right. At first I brushed it off, thinking it was a one-time thing, but I was wrong. This became a regular occurrence. I'd see cars pulling onto my property every few days like it was some kind of public road. It wasn't just annoying, it was the sheer audacity of how casual they were about it. I even tried waving at them to signal, "Hey, this isn't a road." But most drivers either ignored me or gave me a look that said, "Why does it even matter?" For a while, I tried to let it go, thinking maybe it wasn't worth the fight. But one day, I came home from work to find that a car had taken the turn onto my property too wide, spinning out and tearing up a chunk of my yard. That was the breaking point for me. I'd had enough. I called the HOA, thinking they'd want to handle something like this quickly. After all, wasn't it in their best interest to keep the neighborhood orderly? Apparently, I was wrong. When I explained the situation, they shrugged it off with a simple, "Well, that strip of land isn't under our jurisdiction, so there's nothing we can do about it." Really? Nothing? That was the moment I realized if I didn't solve this problem, no one would. I decided to take matters into my own hands. No more waiting for someone else to fix this mess. I hired a contractor, and within days, a sturdy gate and a proper fence were standing tall around my property. To make things crystal clear, I even put up bright, unmistakable no trespassing signs along the strip. If anyone tried to claim they didn't know better, they'd have no excuse now. I'd read plenty of stories online about situations like mine, how HOA boards often turn a blind eye when something doesn't directly involve them. It seemed like I wasn't alone in dealing with this kind of negligence, but what I didn't expect was how quickly things would escalate once the fence went up. Less than a week later, I pulled into my driveway one Saturday to find a car idling by my new gate, honking like it owned the place. Curious, I parked and stepped out to see what was going on. That's when I saw her, the most entitled woman I've ever encountered. Let's call her Karen. Karen was leaning on her car horn, her face already red with anger, waiting for me to come out and fix whatever she thought was wrong. She didn't even wait for me to say a word. The moment she saw me, she stormed out of her car and started marching toward me like she was on a mission. I didn't recognize her at first, but it didn't take long for her to introduce herself in the most unpleasant way possible. She didn't waste a second. "Are you the one who put up this gate?" she barked. "You need to open it. I'm already late." Her tone dripped with entitlement, as if my property existed solely for her convenience. I took a deep breath, trying to process the audacity of what I was witnessing. Then it clicked. This wasn't just some random angry driver. From the stories I'd read online about power-hungry HOA members, I quickly pieced it together. Karen was part of the HOA board. I'd heard plenty of horror stories about people like her, those who think their HOA title gives them the right to control anything and everything around them, including property that doesn't belong to them. And here she was, acting like my land was her personal shortcut. She wasted no time getting straight to the point. "Are you the one who put up this gate? You need to open it now. I'm already late," she snapped, her face twisted into a look of pure disdain, as if I'd just committed some grave offense. For a moment, I was caught off guard. It's not every day someone storms onto your property with that level of entitlement. But then it hit me. This was exactly the kind of behavior I'd read about when researching HOA disputes. People like Karen, especially those in positions of perceived authority, often believe they have a right to anything and everything. They're used to calling the shots, and when someone challenges them, they don't take it lightly. This wasn't just a rude neighbor. This was someone who thought my property was hers to control. I knew this was one of those moments where I had to stand my ground. If I let her walk all over me now, it would never stop. So there I stood, facing a woman who clearly wasn't used to hearing the word no, and that's exactly what I was about to tell her. With as much calm as I could muster, I said firmly, "This is my property, and I don't want anyone driving through it. You're trespassing." That was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. Her face turned an alarming shade of red as she practically yelled back, "You can't block this road. I'm on the HOA board and we've been using this access point for years. You have no right to stop us. I'll have you know the HOA will hear about this and you'll regret it." I took a deep breath. I wasn't about to let her intimidate me. I'd done my homework on HOA rules, and I knew for a fact that she had no authority over my land. Calmly, but firmly, I explained, "This strip of land isn't a public road. It's part of my property, and I have every legal right to block access to it." But Karen wasn't having any of it. Her voice grew louder, her words sharper, as she repeated her demands. "Open this gate. You'll regret this. You don't know who you're messing with," she hissed, reaching for her phone as if that would somehow give her the upper hand. I watched as she started dialing, clearly calling someone, probably the HOA, to report her so-called injustice. At that moment, I couldn't help but wonder what she thought she'd accomplish. Did she really believe the HOA had the power to override property rights? Then, as if to outdo herself, Karen went one step further. She called the police. Yes, she actually called the police over a gate on private property. It's almost a given that HOA disputes tend to spiral into absurdity. Some people on HOA boards act like they're untouchable, as if their title grants them the power to bend laws and enforce their will, even on private property that has nothing to do with their jurisdiction. Karen, of course, was the perfect example of this mindset. She was convinced her position gave her the right to bully me into opening my gate and letting her trespass on my land. Luckily, I had done my homework. I knew exactly where my property lines were, and I knew the HOA had zero authority over land outside their neighborhood. So, when the police finally arrived, I wasn't worried. If anything, I was confident they'd see through her nonsense and back me up. The first officer approached me with a look of mild confusion, holding a notepad in his hand. "We got a call about someone blocking a road," he said, gesturing toward the gate I'd installed. "Is this a public road?" "No, officer," I explained calmly. "This is my property. I put up the gate to stop people from using it as a shortcut. The person who called you, Karen, was trespassing and trying to treat it like a public road, but it's not." To make things crystal clear, I handed him a copy of the property map I'd gotten from the township. It clearly showed that the strip of land in question was mine, and the gate was well within my property lines. The officer studied the map, then gave a quick nod. "Got it. That's clear. This is private property. I'll go talk to the other officer." As he walked away, I could hear Karen's shrill voice in the distance, arguing with the second officer like her life depended on it. I didn't need to hear the specifics to know she was probably spewing some over-the-top claims about how I was ruining the neighborhood or abusing my property rights. But I wasn't worried. Moments later, the officer returned, his expression calm but firm. "I'm sorry, but it seems like she's been misinformed," he said. "This isn't a public road, and you're completely within your rights to block access to it. I'm going to explain that to her. It looks like she didn't quite understand the situation." He walked back toward Karen, who was still in full meltdown mode, waving her arms and talking over the other officer. Even from a distance, I could hear snippets of her rant about how the HOA was going to make me regret this. I had to stifle a laugh. Her threats were as hollow as her claims, and the more she shouted, the more ridiculous she sounded. Karen's problem was the same as many overzealous HOA board members. They assume their authority extends far beyond what's actually allowed. Sure, HOAs can enforce rules within their neighborhood, but they have no power over private property outside of it. And this was a textbook example of an HOA member overestimating their reach. I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief as the officers talked to Karen. They were clearly on my side, and her arguments were going nowhere. For a moment, I thought this might finally be the end of it. But then, true to her over-the-top nature, Karen decided to escalate things even further. As the officers wrapped up their conversation with Karen, she stormed over to me, her face flushed with anger and her fists clenched. "This isn't over!" she spat through gritted teeth. "I'll make sure the HOA takes action against you. You'll regret this. You can't just block access to a road people have been using for years." Her threats were almost comical at this point, but I didn't flinch. Keeping my voice steady, I replied, "Feel free to try, but let me make one thing clear. This is my property, and I have every right to do what I've done. If anyone tries to use it again without my permission, I'll call the police myself." The officers, clearly done with the drama, gave me a nod of approval before walking away. Karen, however, made sure to throw one last withering glare in my direction before stomping back to her car. Watching her retreat, I felt a small, satisfying sense of victory. Her outburst had been ridiculous, and I was glad the officers saw through it. Later that evening, I decided to review the footage from my security cameras, curious to see how her meltdown had looked from another angle. Sure enough, there she was, flailing her arms, shouting, and pacing like a character in a bad soap opera. Watching it back, I couldn't help but laugh at how absurd the whole situation had become. She genuinely seemed to believe I was the one in the wrong, despite the fact that she had been blatantly trespassing on my property. For a few days after that, everything was surprisingly quiet. No cars turned onto my property, and Karen's threats didn't materialize into anything concrete. It seemed like, for once, common sense had prevailed, and I allowed myself to hope the ordeal was finally over. But of course, when it comes to HOAs, peace rarely lasts long. About a week later, I opened my mailbox to find an official-looking envelope with the HOA's logo stamped on the front. As soon as I saw it, I let out a small chuckle. I hadn't expected them to give up so easily, and sure enough, Karen had clearly gone over my head to involve the rest of the board. The letter was as dramatic as I had anticipated. It stated that the HOA wanted to schedule a meeting to address my actions, specifically the fence and gate that, in their words, were blocking a public access point. I held the letter in my hands, laughing softly at the sheer audacity of it all. Did they seriously believe they could force me to take down a gate on land that I owned? The answer was simple. They couldn't. I had spent hours researching property laws, and I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was well within my rights. My property lines were clear, and my fence had been built legally and according to code. There was absolutely nothing they could do to make me back down. The letter itself was full of contradictions. On one hand, the HOA acknowledged that I owned the land. On the other, they argued that because residents had been using it as a shortcut for years, I was somehow obligated to keep it accessible. They even threw in a line about community needs and how I was disrupting the neighborhood's convenience. The whole thing was laughable. Just because something had been used out of convenience didn't make it public property. I folded the letter, set it aside, and smiled to myself. If they thought I was going to cave to their pressure, they had another thing coming. I knew I couldn't walk into the HOA meeting unprepared, so I made sure to gather every piece of evidence I had. I brought along the property lines, a detailed map from the township, photos of my land, and of course the security footage of Karen's dramatic meltdown. I wasn't about to take any chances. When the day of the meeting arrived, I walked into the HOA office ready for anything. The room was packed with board members, most of whom were glaring at me like I was the villain in some neighborhood soap opera. At the head of the table sat Karen, her arms crossed and a smug grin plastered across her face. She looked like someone who thought the outcome was already in the bag, but I had no intention of making this easy for her. The meeting began with the board president calmly laying out the issue. He explained how my fence was blocking access to what they considered a public road, and how several neighbors had complained about it. Before he could finish, Karen cut in, her voice dripping with indignation. "This is affecting the entire community," she declared. "That shortcut is the easiest way into our neighborhood, and now we're forced to use the main road. which adds several extra minutes to our drive. I've been on this board for years, and we've never had a problem with this access point until now." I sat quietly, letting her finish her speech. She was clearly trying to stir up emotions, painting me as the bad guy disrupting the lives of innocent neighbors. But I knew better. Once she was done, I raised my hand to speak, and the president nodded for me to proceed. "I understand your concerns," I began, keeping my tone firm but respectful. "But let's be clear, this isn't a public road. It's private property, my property, and I have every legal right to block access to it. I've done my homework, and this strip of land has always been privately owned. If anyone had taken the time to do their research, they'd see that the HOA has no jurisdiction here. You can't enforce rules on land that doesn't belong to you." For a moment, the room was silent. Karen's smug expression faltered, and I could see some of the board members exchanging uncertain glances. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in, but Karen wasn't ready to give up just yet. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Just because you have some paperwork saying you own the land doesn't mean you can turn our lives upside down. We've been using that shortcut for years without any issues. You're creating unnecessary problems." Her voice grew louder with every word, but the murmurs from the other board members told a different story. One of them finally spoke up. "Are we sure this is even something the HOA has control over?" Another nodded in agreement. "If it's his property, I don't think we can legally do anything about it. Karen, maybe we should focus on resolving this without making it worse." I could feel the tide turning. The more I stood my ground, the more the board members seemed to realize they didn't have a leg to stand on. Karen, however, wasn't ready to back down. Her frustration was written all over her face, but I knew I had the upper hand, and there was no way I was letting her push me around. I could feel the atmosphere in the room shifting. My argument was starting to resonate with the board members. The more I laid out the facts, that the HOA had absolutely no control over private property, the more their confidence seemed to waver. Some of them exchanged uneasy glances, clearly realizing their position wasn't as strong as they'd hoped. But Karen, she wasn't ready to back down. Her face turned a deeper shade of red as she suddenly stood up, slamming her hands on the table with dramatic flair. "This isn't over," she barked. "I'm going to escalate this. You'll regret letting him get away with this." Before things could spiral further, the board president raised his hand, signaling for calm. He seemed eager to de-escalate the situation. "Karen," he said firmly, "I think we've discussed this enough for now. We need to review the legalities and consult with our attorney before making any further decisions. But for now, it seems we have no choice but to respect the property owner's rights." It wasn't a massive victory, but it felt like a significant step forward. The board seemed to realize they were walking on shaky legal ground. Karen, however, didn't share their caution. She was clearly fuming as the meeting ended, her frustration written all over her face. I knew this wasn't the last I'd hear from her, but I was ready for whatever she might try next. For a while after the meeting, things were surprisingly quiet. The HOA, now cautious, seemed hesitant to push the issue further. They'd told Karen they'd review the legalities, but it was clear they weren't eager to stir the pot again. Karen, though, wasn't one to retreat easily. Over the next few weeks, I started receiving letters from the HOA, each one more aggressive than the last. They demanded that I remove the gate and restore access, threatening vague legal consequences if I didn't comply. But it was all bluff, and I knew it. I stayed calm and went about my life, confident that I'd done everything by the book. I checked my cameras regularly, just in case anyone decided to test my resolve. Interestingly, some of my neighbors who had been using the shortcut actually reached out to me. A few apologized, admitting they'd been in the wrong and promised they wouldn't trespass again. Others remained indifferent, but at least I knew not everyone was on Karen's side. Then, one day, while I was out running errands, my phone buzzed with a call from my lawyer. His voice carried a hint of amusement as he explained the latest twist. Karen had hired a lawyer of her own and was now threatening to take me to court. Her claim? That the HOA had authorized the road as a public access point and that I'd violated some sort of community easement by blocking it. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. My lawyer reassured me that there was no easement, no legal grounds for her argument, and certainly no way she could win this. Still, Karen's persistence was both irritating and, in a strange way, fascinating. It seemed she was determined to fight a battle she had no chance of winning. My lawyer quickly reassured me that Karen's claims were baseless. There was no easement, no legal precedent, and absolutely no way the HOA had any authority over my land. It was clear this was nothing more than a desperate attempt to intimidate me into taking down the gate. Still, her relentless persistence was starting to get under my skin. I knew she wouldn't give up easily, and the idea of a prolonged legal battle wasn't appealing. I had no interest in wasting my time, energy, or money fighting her nonsense. That's when I decided to take a different approach, one that would not only shut down her efforts, but also put the spotlight on what was really going on. I reached out to a local news station known for covering property disputes and HOA overreach. I sent them a detailed outline of the situation, complete with photos of my property, the fence, and the threatening letters I'd received from the HOA. To my surprise, they responded almost immediately. Not only were they interested in the story, but they wanted to schedule an interview as soon as possible. A few days later, I found myself sitting in front of a camera, telling my side of the story. I explained how the HOA was trying to overstep its boundaries, and how I'd taken every possible legal step to ensure my actions were above board. The news team was incredibly supportive, allowing me to highlight the larger issue of HOAs prioritizing their own agendas over the rights of property owners. I also called attention to their pattern of ignoring genuine resident concerns while focusing on petty power plays like this one. That evening, the segment aired on the local news, and the response was overwhelming. The story struck a chord with viewers, many of whom had likely faced similar battles with overreaching HOAs. It didn't take long for the tide to turn. The following week, Karen called me again, but this time her tone was completely different. Gone was the fiery, entitled Karen from before. Instead, her voice sounded hesitant, almost apologetic. "I saw the news," she began. "I realize now that I may have overreacted." She went on to explain that after the news coverage, many of her neighbors had turned against her. Some had even criticized her and the HOA's tactics, pointing out how unreasonable they had been. For the first time, Karen admitted that the HOA had no real claim to my land, and acknowledged that she'd been far too aggressive in trying to force me to remove the gate. She even apologized for the way she had treated me. Hearing those words from her was surreal. This was the same woman who, just weeks earlier, had been shouting threats and calling the police on me. While I wasn't ready to forgive her completely, I could tell she'd learned a lesson, and maybe, just maybe, she'd think twice before pulling a stunt like this again. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was not the Karen who had stormed onto my property weeks ago, shouting threats and calling the police. Her tone, her words, it was almost unrecognizable. While I wasn't ready to fully forgive her for all the chaos she'd caused, it was clear she'd finally realized how far out of line she had been. It was a surprising twist to the story, one I hadn't seen coming, but it felt like the beginning of the end. Not long after the news segment aired, I received a formal letter from the HOA. To my surprise, the tone was completely different from their earlier aggressive communications. They actually apologized for their involvement in the dispute and assured me they wouldn't pursue any further action. The letter also included a reminder to residents, urging them to respect private property and refrain from trespassing. The most unexpected part? Karen, according to the letter, had been advised to step down from her position on the board. They didn't go into details, but the message was clear. Her actions had backfired spectacularly. It felt like more than just a personal win. It was a victory for anyone who had ever been harassed or bullied by an overreaching HOA. I had stood my ground, armed with facts and determination, and in the end, my rights had been upheld. My gate remained locked, the road stayed blocked, and most importantly, my property was finally secure from unwelcome intrusions. As the months passed, life returned to normal. The HOA shifted its attention to other matters, and Karen seemed to vanish from the neighborhood's radar. I could finally enjoy my home in peace, without the looming threat of entitled neighbors or HOA drama hanging over me. Looking back, it was a long and exhausting battle, but it taught me an important lesson. Standing up for yourself, no matter how challenging it might be, is always worth it. Looking back, it was a battle I never expected. Trespassing cars, heated arguments, and HOA threats. But it taught me the importance of standing firm. Now, the questions have stopped. The HOA is silent, and my property is finally mine to enjoy in peace. Sometimes I see cars slow down near the old shortcut, and I wonder if they regret losing it. But one thing's certain, they'll never use my land again.